Chapter 9, Lesson 2, Fighting for Independence. The soldiers are starving, says Marquis de Lafayette. They eat nothing but fire cake made of flour and water. Your stomach growls. Since Congress won't send help, General George Washington says, I'll order the local farmers to sell us their crops. The air outside is cold, but you don't care. Let's go, you yell. We're finally going to get food. So comparing the armies, the Continentals against the British. In July 1775, George Washington arrived in Massachusetts to take command of the Continental Army. The soldiers had no uniforms, only their everyday clothes. Many had no guns, so they carried spears and axes. Some had fought in the French and Indian War, but most had no military training. Many were farmers who had just enlisted or signed up to fight. Washington was once so angry that he threw his hat on the ground and shouted, Are these the men with which I am to defend America? Keeping the army fed and clothed took a lot of supplies. Washington told Congress that his army needed 100,000 barrels of flour and 20 million pounds of meat a year. Congress could not raise enough money to pay for everything the army needed. And they were against a strong enemy. The Continental Army went to war against one of the most powerful armies in the world. The British Army was made up of experienced soldiers. The British had about 50,000 soldiers in the colonies. Washington rarely had more than 15,000 soldiers in his army at any time. The British Army also used mercenaries, or hired soldiers. Because many of the mercenaries came from a German region called Hesse-Cassel, Americans called them Hessians. But the British had problems too. It was hard to fight a war 3,000 miles away from home. Loyalists gave some aid, but the British soldiers still had to wait a long time for supplies and soldiers to replace them. Cause and effect, reading check. What caused problems for the British Army? Early battles in the North. By the spring of 1776, Washington and his army had moved south from Massachusetts to New York. They were camped on Long Island when British troops attacked them. The Americans suffered great losses at the Battle of Long Island. The British Army then chased Washington and his army. Many American soldiers had left after the Battle of Long Island, and Washington had to ask the others to stay. He and the soldiers who stayed did their best not to get caught by the British. By winter, they had marched through New Jersey and on to Pennsylvania. British General William Howe and most of the British Army were still in New York. A surprise attack. By December of 1776, thousands of American soldiers were ready to give up. Washington came up with a plan to attack the Hessian mercenaries in Trenton, New Jersey. At this time in history, armies rarely fought battles in winter. Washington knew he could surprise the Hessians. On Christmas night of 1776, Patriot troops crossed the icy Delaware River in rowboats and marched 9 miles to Trenton. There they found the Hessian troops sleeping. They attacked, and the fighting lasted only an hour before the Hessians surrendered. The victory at Trenton gave American soldiers hope for the future. An important victory. In 1777, the British Army planned a new campaign. The campaign is a series of military actions carried out for a certain goal. The goal was to separate the New England colonies from the other colonies. The British thought that if they controlled all of New York, they could cut off communications and supplies to Massachusetts and the rest of New England. The British campaign called for many groups of soldiers to go to Albany, New York. There, they were supposed to join troops led by British General John Burgoyne, coming down from Canada. Together, they would attack the city from the north, south, and west. This plan might have worked, but the British troops never reached Albany. They were slowed by battles along the way. The Battle of Saratoga. On September 19, 1777, Continental forces circled General Burgoyne's army near the town of Saratoga, New York. Burgoyne and his soldiers could not break through the Americans' lines. The Battle of Saratoga was really 2 battles that took place over 3 weeks. During the second battle, the American general, Benedict Arnold, led a group of soldiers in a daring attack. On October 17th, Burgoyne surrendered to the American General Horatio Gates. The British loss at Saratoga was a turning point in the war. A turning point is an event that causes an important change. It looked as if the Americans might have a chance to win the war. Cause and effect. What caused people to believe America could win the war? Winter at Valley Forge. In the fall of 1777, the Continental Army faced trouble. While trying to keep the British from taking Philadelphia, the Continental Army lost a battle at Brandywine, Pennsylvania. In September, British soldiers captured Philadelphia, where they got ready to spend the winter in comfort. The tired Continental soldiers moved to Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. Washington chose this place so that he could keep watch on the British. The Continental Army at Valley Forge was a ragged group. Congress did not have the money to send supplies. Most soldiers wore clothing brought from home, but it had been torn and burned from battle. Some of the men's shoes were falling apart. Many wrapped their feet in rags. To keep their spirits up, soldiers sang Yankee Doodle. Even though the song was written during the French and Indian War to make fun of the colonists, the Americans turned it around to make fun of the British. Since food was also running low, Washington led his troops buy food from farmers with money from Congress. New York Governor George Clinton sent barrels of salted pork. More help came from the 20-year-old Marquis de Lafayette, who traveled from France to join the Continental Army. Lafayette later said he had an American heart. Washington liked the young man and gave him important jobs. Lafayette spent his own money to buy warm clothes for the soldiers he led. He was so giving that they called him the soldier's friend. Life at Valley Forge also got better when Frederick Wilhelm von Steuben arrived. Von Steuben was a German soldier who taught the American troops better ways to march and fight. He showed them how to work together and gave them confidence. By 1778, the Continental Army was much stronger. Contributions from other nations. While the war raged on in North America, Benjamin Franklin was in France, negotiating with the French government. To negotiate is to try to reach an agreement among different people. Franklin asked the French for supplies and soldiers. He said that France would benefit from helping beat its old enemy, Britain. At first, the French offered only secret help, thinking that Britain would win. When news of the American victory at Saratoga reached France, the French agreed to help the Americans. Guns, money, and food. In 1779, Spain declared war on Britain. Bernardo de Galvez, the governor of Spanish Louisiana, gave guns, food, and money to the Americans. Later, his troops captured many British forts. Jorge Farragut came from Spain to fight for the Americans. Other nations also helped. In 1781, the Netherlands gave a loan to Congress. Russian leaders tried to keep the British from blocking trade with the Americans. Summary. The Continental Army was less trained than the British Army. However, the Americans won important early victories at Trenton and Saratoga. Other nations helped the Patriot cause.